Well, hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Stacy DeMertzis. I am one of the tutors at Pure Connections, and I'm one of the Biology 66 Physiology tutors. I'm excited to be here today to go over concepts that are related to your upcoming Lecture 3 exam, and also do a little bit of review of some of the concepts from the previous exam. Hopefully, we can kind of get ready for the final that will be in several weeks. So this is just a very hopefully interactive study session. Feel free to answer any questions. You can unmute or you can put some questions in the chat, and we will we'll do some practice problems together. All right, so some of the concepts that we will be going over today. So for lecture exam 3, you learn a lot about the heart and blood and circulation and cardiac output and blood pressure. There's also information on the respiratory system as well as the renal system. The endocrine system, I actually would like you all to tell me, in previous years it was included in the lecture 3 exam. However, I believe you guys already covered it for lecture 2. Is that correct? Were you guys already tested on endocrine? You were? Okay. So we'll go over endocrine a little bit just for a little review, but we can go through those pretty quickly. Okay. So so let's do a little bit of review on endocrine before we get into the lecture exam 3. So so let's do some practice problems. So start off with number 1. So homeostasis is the state of dynamic constancy and maintenance of equilibrium. How is homeostasis achieved? Now, this is for pretty much every system in the body, but we're going to see an example of how this relates to the endocrine system. So I already see some answers in the chat. B, negative feedback loop. Yes, absolutely. So negative feedback loop is whenever there's a change in our internal systems, a change or a deviation from the set point, we want a response within our body to bring it back to the set point, so in the opposite direction. So let's think about an example with the endocrine system. So we know that in the endocrine system, we have glands that secrete hormones. And so I want you to tell me which glands are part of which response to maintain homeostasis, because certain glands have their own function. So I want you all to tell me. And there could be multiple answers here. So you can put your answers in the chat, or you can unmute and share out loud. Select all that apply for this question. Okay, A, because of cortisol. Yeah, so A is definitely one of them because the adrenal glands are going to secrete cortisol, and that is our stress hormone, right? So whenever there's a stressful response or a stressful stimulus, our adrenal glands will secrete cortisol. So A is one of them. What would be another response for this? A, B, the thyroid gland secretes hormones that respond to metabolism regulation. Yeah, that's one of them. So the thyroid gland, there's a lot of thyroid hormones that come from the thyroid gland, and their job has to do with regulating metabolism. Yeah, so those are our 2 answers for those. Those are some examples of how homeostasis is maintained specifically within the endocrine system. So good work answering those. All right, so A little bit, we're going to continue with the stress example. So how the body physiologically responds to stress. Before we really understand or list the specific pathway, a key thing, and this is really how oftentimes anatomy connects with physiology, is it's really important to recognize in these processes what is considered a gland and what is considered a hormone. So on the left here, these are things that are involved with the physiological response to stress. We have the hypothalamus, which is a structure in the brain, adrenal cortex, and the kidneys. We have the pituitary gland, we have cortisol, as we were talking about earlier. So let's start off with glands first. Out of all of these things listed here, and there are 3. So this is nice because it's even 3 and 3. We got 3 glands and 3 hormones. I want you all to tell me, what are the glands? What are the 3 glands here? And just to keep in mind, this list that I have is in no particular order. This is not the sequence. We're going to go over the sequence later. This is just simply a word bank that we can use. Hypothalamus is a gland. Yes, absolutely. It's a gland in the brain. That's one of them. Adrenal cortex, glands found on top of the kidneys. And then the anterior pituitary is another structure within the brain. Perfect. So those are 3 glands that are responsible for the physiological response to stress. So then our 3 hormones, so we already answered the 3 glands. The 3 hormones would be CRH, ACTH, and cortisol. Those are the 3 hormones that are going to be released at different points within this entire physiological response. And so we're going to practice knowing that order. And so oftentimes when we're studying endocrine physiology, right, we learn about the 3 hormone sequence, correct? So I want you all to tell me, and I'm going to see if I can annotate on this screen. So if I were to tell you that we're starting off with stress. So that's number 1, stress. That is the stimulus. So there's some stressful thing that's going on. That is the stimulus. What is our body going to do to respond to this stress? What is the pathway? So I want you all to tell me, what is the first thing that's going to be involved? What's the first gland that's going to realize this change? So now we got to think about the pathway. Yep, the hypothalamus. So number 2, that's the second step. So we got stress. It's going to trigger the hypothalamus. Now, what would the next step be? Think about the 3 hormone pathway. The hypothalamus is going to secrete a hormone. Now, what hormone would that be? The CRH, yep. And so I see also some comments in the chat right after hypothalamus talking about the anterior pituitary. That's correct, in which that's the next gland that's going to be triggered. But before we get there, the hypothalamus is going to release CRH, right? So we've got hypothalamus releases CRH. That triggers the anterior pituitary gland to release yet another, or the next hormone in the sequence. So which hormone is the anterior pituitary gland releasing? Yeah, we got ACTH. And then that's going to trigger our last gland, which the last gland we have here is the adrenal cortex. And then, as we talked about in our first practice problem, is that the adrenal cortex secretes cortisol. That is the stress hormone. So that's an example of how the 3 hormone pathway works. Let me clear these annotations. And we can go on to the next example. You know what I'll do? Just to keep on time, we're going to skip this example. If we have time at the end, we'll come back to it. But same concept. You have 3 glands, 3 hormones, or what's unique about this one is that growth of thyroid is obviously not a hormone, but it's a response to this 3 hormone pathway. So it's like this end result that we get. So we'll come back to this one if we have time, but it's the same concept that we did previously. So let's get into the content for lecture exam 3. So we learn a lot about the blood, the heart, and circulation. So let's talk a little bit about the blood first. So when we take a sample of blood and we put it in what's called a centrifuge, it spins it around really fast and it separates blood into its 3 main components, although one of them contains 2 things. So it's really 4 items. It's going to split it up like this. So I want you all to tell me, and I'll draw arrows kind of connecting to it. What do we have? Let's start with this yellow. This is about 55% of blood is this kind of yellowish content. And what do we call this? Plasma, that's correct. So plasma is this yellow stuff. All right, what about this thin white line here? It's about less than 1% of blood content makes up this. So white blood cells, yep. And also, good job answering the chat that this is also where the platelets are found. White blood cells are responsible for fighting infection and play a big role in our immune system. And then platelets are responsible for allowing blood to clot. And so our last structure right here is the, I'm going to have to come around, the red blood cells. This is about 45% of blood content. And the red blood cells do a lot. They don't have a nucleus. They're these cells that kind of look like a little disc because they're indented a little bit. And a lot's going on in the red blood cells. So what we're going to do is we're going to answer this question right here. And when we're studying blood, we learn a lot about how blood flows. Obviously, we just talked about the components of blood, but then blood's relationship to oxygen and how it delivers oxygen and nutrients to our cells and tissues. So I want you all to tell me, what is the difference between hematocrit and hemoglobin? 2 really important concepts in blood, but they're a little bit different from each other. So this is another select all that apply type of question. I want you to tell me, just tell me what the correct statements are here. Okay, I see a choice for A. Hematocrit assesses how much of one's blood volume consists of actual red blood cells. Okay. Let's see what else we can pick out. B, hemoglobin is in the red blood cells and it carries oxygen to the tissues. Yes. And so with that, we can kind of rule out C and D, because those are, the rest of the statement is talking about what it does, but obviously the vocabulary isn't matched correctly. So yes, hematocrit is talking about how much of one's blood volume is red blood cells. And then hemoglobin is when we're assessing the red blood cells themselves, it's looking at, the oxygen. So these red blood cells carry oxygen to the tissues, and we can assess that with hemoglobin. Number E, or letter E, kind of a trick question. So hemoglobin is in the red blood cells. Yes, it is. And it carries gas to the tissues, but it's oxygen that it's carrying. It's not carbon dioxide. So A and B for that one. So good job answering that. Let me clear these annotations. We can go on to the next one. Okay, so so we talked about blood. Now let's talk about blood vessels. So blood travels through our body through different blood vessels. And so I have these blood vessels listed here. And specifically, what this picture is showing is systemic vessels. We have red oxygenated arteries and arterioles. Of course, our capillaries are in that in between because that's when the gas exchange is occurring. And it's this transition to the next type of vessel, which are the veins. So we have the venules and we have veins, which they carry deoxygenated blood. So these are systemic. If we were talking about pulmonary, it would be the opposite, right? The veins would be red and oxygenated, and the arteries would be blue and deoxygenated. But in this problem, we're talking about systemic vessels. So here is an image with the systemic vessels labeled. And so I want us to match each vessel to its respective function. So let's start with number 1. So which vessel here performs vasoconstriction and vasodilation to alter blood flow? The arterial, yep. Let's see if I can draw an arrow. Yep, the arterial. And not that the arteries don't do it, but when we're specifically studying it, we like to talk about arteries for its other functions that we list here. So actually on that note, let's answer what arteries would be. So that's arterial, vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Let's talk about arteries. So what do systemic arteries do? So I see the third one. Oh, and I lost my mouse. Okay, let's see if I can get it back. Okay, yeah, so systemic arteries pump blood away from the heart. And within these systemic arteries, we have a lot of pressure, not a ton of volume, but this is where a lot of pressure is found. There's a high pressure. So let's see if I can draw that here. Okay, so that's our artery. So we got arteries and arterioles. Oops, sorry, I put it on the wrong one. Okay, so arterial has the vasoconstriction, vasodilation. Artery has high pressure and it's pumping blood away from the heart. All right, let's do what's easier to type. So I'll list the function and then I'll have you guys list the vessel. I keep losing my mouse. Okay, so which vessel exchanges substances between the vessels and the cells? Capillaries, yep. So my mouse. All right, capillaries. They exchange substances between the vessels and the cells, and this is where this gas exchange is occurring. And then which vessel pumps blood to the heart? And contrary to the arteries, arteries have high pressure and low volume. Which vessel has low pressure but a high amount of high volume? Veins, absolutely. Veins are systemic veins, specifically are, well, and pulmonary veins too, would bring blood back to the heart. But in the case of systemic veins, they're deoxygenated. And so when we compare veins to venules, right, I like to think of venules as, because they're after the capillaries but before the veins, they're still deoxygenated. So I remind myself that this is the point where now blood is deoxygenated. the arteries and the arterioles dropped off the oxygen to the cells and the tissues. The capillaries did this gas exchange between the vessels and the cells. And now we're transitioning. We've lost our oxygen. Now we're transitioning to venules and veins, which are deoxygenated blood in systemic circulation. And we want this blood, by definition of systemic vein, to, travel back to the heart to start this process over again. So good work answering those. We'll go on to the next one. All right, so this one is kind of a longer practice problem, but we talked about how blood flows through the specific vessels, the arteries, the veins, the capillaries, and what their roles are. And we touched a little bit on how the reason why oxygen and lack of oxygen occur in different vessels is when we think about just how blood flows, right? Deoxygenated blood wants to go to the heart, then to the lungs, then back to the heart, then to the body, so that the oxygen can be delivered to our organ systems, our organs, our cells, and our tissues. But after that oxygen is dropped off, it's got to start the process all over again. So imagine as if we were at that stage right now. So the blood, the oxygenated blood, drops off the oxygen to the cells and the tissues so that our body can use it, because it's very essential. And now the blood is deoxygenated. What is our pathway? So what is the pathway of blood through the heart? And of course, the lungs are involved, but we're not going to go into those details. For step number 8, we're just going to simply say the blood goes to the lungs and becomes oxygenated. But then it's going to travel back to the heart, but we need to know, like, specifically, this is where knowledge of heart anatomy is really going to come into play. So let's see how we can do this. I think if you guys tell me your answers, I can type on the, oh, cool. Yeah, I can type on these lines right here. All right, so number 1, we have systemic veins, which are carrying deoxygenated blood, hence why we highlight it in blue to remind ourselves that. What is the next structure that the blood is going to travel through when we're entering the heart? And you can use the diagram to the left to help you. Okay, so I see vena cava. So we have a superior and an inferior vena cava. So we see number 2, we talk about 2 places, the superior and inferior vena cava. And then I also see in the chat, we're going to jump into the atrium, but which type of atrium? Is it the right atrium or the left atrium? Yeah, the right, exactly. And I know it seems kind of funny because it looks like it's on the left side, but when we're studying anatomy and physiology, or specifically anatomy, you're studying it as if, and you're labeling it as if you're looking at somebody else. So if we were to kind of like turn with this picture and match it, then it would be the right side. So it's a mirrored image. All right, so the right atrium. And then after the right atrium, in order for it to go into this number 5 down here, this structure, we need to pass through a valve. And it's called an atrioventricular valve because it separates the atrium from the next structure. But it has a specific name. The right one specifically has its own name. What would the name of the right atrioventricular valve be? Yeah, the tricuspid. And that's because it has 3 flaps, as you can see. And tri means 3, so we call this the tricuspid atrioventricular valve. And then number 5, the name of the valve kind of gives us a hint, but what would we call number 5? We're still on the right side of the heart, but it's not the atrium, it's a different name. Yeah, the ventricle. And then after the right ventricle, we're gonna, at this point, we're getting closer to the lungs, but we still need to hit some structures, go through some structures before we get to the lungs. So the right ventricle has this deoxygenated blood that's then going to pass through a valve. And this one is it's not a type of atrioventricular valve because we're not splitting an atrium from a ventricle. So we call this a semilunar valve, but what would the name of this valve be? And think about it in context to the artery that's going to be next. Yeah, the pulmonary valve. Because then we're going to hit the pulmonary artery. And then the pulmonary artery, it's deoxygenated blood because we haven't reached the lungs yet. But when we think of the definition of artery, right? Artery, any type of artery, makes blood travel away from the heart. I like to say away for arteries. It's contrary to veins. Both types of veins, whether it's systemic or pulmonary, bring blood back to the heart. So veins bring blood to the heart. Arteries take blood away from the heart. So pulmonary veins, even though it's deoxygenated, right? Because it hasn't gone to the lungs yet. It's an artery because blood is leaving the heart at this point and it's going to the lungs. The lungs then oxygenate the blood, and that's what we want. And so we want to then use this oxygenated blood and deliver it to the rest of our body, to all of our cells and tissues so that they can use it. But I like to emphasize, and I like to think about the heart as like the home base in a way. So now that we have this newly oxygenated blood, thanks to the lungs, before we can deliver it to the rest of our body, we have to go back to the heart to pump it to the rest of our body. So how are we going to deliver this newly oxygenated blood back to the heart? Through the pulmonary veins. And so pulmonary because, it's pertaining to the lungs, but the word veins because we're going to the heart. And then we, color code it in red to emphasize and to identify that these vessels are carrying oxygenated blood. So our pulmonary veins are going to return this blood or deliver this newly oxygenated blood into the heart. And so what structure in the heart gets this newly oxygenated blood? What would we call this? Yep, the left atrium. And again, it's like we're looking at somebody else. So the right is really the left atrium. Yep. And then we have another atrioventricular valve because we're going to go down into a ventricle here. But we don't call it a tricuspid valve. What do we call this and why? Why does it have a different name? Well, what is the name? And then we'll talk about why it's a little bit different than tricuspid. Yeah, we call it a bicuspid. It's because unlike the tricuspid valve, the bicuspid valve has two flaps. Bi means two. We also call this the mitral valve, if you've heard that in other classes. I don't know why it's called a mitral valve, but that's another name for bicuspid valve. All right, so after the bicuspid valve, right, it's an atrioventricular valve. So we're going from the left atrium to the left ventricle. And now this is where I like to say it's like showtime, right? We have this newly oxygenated blood, and now here is the time where we can then deliver it to our systemic arteries so that it can go to the rest of our body. But before it gets to the systemic arteries, it's got to go through another valve and another major structure. So we're going to stumble upon another semilunar valve, but it's not the pulmonary valve because we're not going to the lungs. What do we call this valve? Yeah, the aortic valve, because it's connecting to this structure that is known as the largest systemic artery called the aorta. And then the aorta is going to branch off to these systemic arteries, vessels that carry blood away from the heart. They're systemic because they're not going to the lungs specifically, they're going to all over our body. They're not going into the lungs to do gas exchange. They're just going to deliver the oxygen to the rest of our body systems. And so we color code that as red to represent that. So good job answering the pathway of blood through the heart, making note of the difference between systemic circulation and pulmonary circulation, the difference between the veins and the arteries. I always recommend when you're studying this, color coding is really helpful, at least in my experience, to really memorize like what's considered deoxygenated, what's considered oxygenated, and so on. So good job answering that. If I go to the next slide, I think the text will follow. So yeah, all right, I'll have to clear that. Okay, good job answering that. Okay, so that is the pathway of blood through the heart. But another important thing to learn in physiology is the heart is going to beat and the heart is going to pump this blood to where it needs to go. But how can the heart do that? There is a really important connection between the nervous system and the cardiovascular system. And actually, the nervous system is often connected with every system in our body because it's, connected to our brain, and that's our command center. And so there's a lot of signaling and messaging that goes on to have our body systems function in the way that they do. So if we think about specifically how the nervous system connects to the heart, in the heart, we have electrical activity. And this electrical activity makes the heart beat by action potentials in the myocardial cells. So basically, myocardial means like muscle cells within the heart. And so how these myocardial cells contract and make the heart beat is by action potentials. And those are signals from the nervous system. And so when we study this on a person, oftentimes you could do an electrocardiogram. And so we see this, we call, from left to right, we have our P wave, we have our QRS complex, and then we have a T wave. And this image that we see here, representing the electrical activity of the heart, corresponds with specific activity that's going on in certain structures of the heart. So how we talked about in the previous problem, the difference between the atrium and the ventricles, we can talk about that here with atrial depolarization, ventricular depolarization, and ventricular repolarization. The difference between depolarization and repolarization has to do with the charge of the neuron, and the charge that, as a resting neuron is typically negative. When there is a stimulus, it can go up to positive. We talk about depolarization the cell becomes more positive, and then repolarization is going back to its resting state of, being negative. So I want you all to tell me, within this P wave, QRS complex, and T wave, which process matches what? So we can start with atrial depolarization. Where would we find atrial depolarization? Or what in this PQRST, this electrical activity of the heart, what part of this diagram is going to represent atrial depolarization? Yeah, the P wave. And then what about ventricular depolarization? The QRS complex, yep. And then where would we see ventricular repolarization? Returning back to, or the resting state, yeah, the T wave. Perfect. So good job by identifying that and seeing how the nervous system and neurological and electrical activity relates to cardiovascular system functioning. All right, so other than blood flow through the heart, how the heart beats, we learn a lot about cardiac output and how blood flows, and even blood pressure. And so in physiology, we learn a lot about regulation. So there are ways to regulate our heart rate. There are ways to regulate our stroke volume. There are ways to regulate our blood pressure. So we're going to look at some examples. So for example, if we wanted to increase heart rate, we have certain hormones like norepinephrine and epinephrine that bind to receptors in the sinoatrial node, which is in the atrium, and it triggers an increase in depolarization rate. And so if we're going to increase depolarization rate, we're going to increase the heart rate, because it's this depolarization, the rate of that depolarization is going to translate into how fast these signals are occurring. And if they're occurring faster, then our heart rate can be faster. If we wanted to decrease heart rate, we would have acetylcholine that would also bind to receptors in the sinoatrial node to do the opposite effect. It would decrease the depolarization rate. So depolarization, right, this act of becoming more positive in this flow of electrical signaling, if that rate is going to slow down, then the signal is going to slow down and our heart rate would then slow down. So that's for heart rate. Stroke volume, we talk a lot about end diastolic volume. So how much volume do we have at the end of diastole? So if we have a higher volume at the end of diastole, the stroke volume will increase because we have more blood within the ventricle. And so the stroke volume, in terms of cardiac output, it has more to pump out. If we think about in instances where we have total peripheral resistance, if that peripheral resistance is higher, then stroke volume is going to decrease a bit, because with this resistance, your blood flow is kind of impeded a bit. And so, so we see that a little bit. And so back to if we wanted to make stroke volume increase, similar kind of concept to heart rate. If you have norepinephrine and epinephrine, as it's increasing the heart rate, if the heart is beating more often, then the ventricles are contracting more often, and then this volume that is being expelled from the ventricles, that will in turn increase as well. So those are some examples, and I have at the top this equation, cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. So basically how fast your heart is beating, how much is being expelled. We take those two factors together, we can measure, okay, how much output is your heart conducting. We talk a little bit about blood volume. There's these two really important hormones, antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone, and they have, they're both related to blood volume, but they have kind of opposite effects. So antidiuretic hormone is going to decrease urine volume. In other words, it's going to increase blood volume. It has to do with water retention. So diuresis is the release of water. So if we say antidiuretic hormone, we're going to keep the water inside. So we're not going to have as much urine because it's going to be within the blood. Aldosterone is going to increase urine volume. So it has the opposite effect. And so if we think about atrial natriuretic peptides, it's a type of hormone that comes from the atrium, and it's going to increase the amount of sodium and water in urine. And a key to remember that is if we think about the word natriuretic, starts with Na, and Na, that is the like element symbol for sodium. So that's something I like to think about to remember that it's talking about sodium and water increasing. And then if we think about blood pressure, always remember that blood tends to flow from an area of high pressure to low pressure. So that's when we're thinking about, for example, systemic arteries, right? Systemic arteries have a lot of pressure. Systemic veins, not so much. And so we see that flow from arteries to veins. Yeah, so that's just a little overview on chapter 14. So we can talk about the respiratory system. Any questions on either endocrine or the cardiovascular system before we do respiratory system? All right, if there are no questions, hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end. But yeah, let's talk about respiratory system. So given the pathway of air, or this is the pathway of air, we oftentimes, it's very similar to a lot of processes or pathways within the human body. So there's a pathway for air. There's a pathway for food in the digestive system. There's a pathway for blood in the heart, which we just went over. There's a pathway for hormones within the blood. There's a pathway for light that travels through our eye. There's a pathway for waves that travel as sound waves so that we can hear. So that's a really kind of consistent concept within human anatomy and physiology. So right now, if we're talking about the respiratory system, here we have listed the pathway of air, starting from the nasal cavity as it enters the body all the way down to the deepest structure of the lungs called the alveoli. And that's where the gas exchange is occurring. Anatomically, we like to break up the respiratory system into the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. So I want you all to tell me which structures would be considered the upper tract and then which structures would be considered the lower. You can put it in the chat or you can unmute. Which structures are collectively known as the upper respiratory tract? So I'll help you guys out with this. So the nasal cavity would be part of the upper tract, the pharynx, the larynx. All of this we would consider the upper respiratory tract. Trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, alveoli, that's considered the lower. And something I like to remember is after the larynx, we have this split between the respiratory system and the digestive system. So anteriorly, we're going to have the trachea, and then we're going to follow that for the respiratory system. Posteriorly, we have the esophagus, and then all the GI system organs or GI tract organs after that, which obviously we're not covering digestive system right now, but if that's just something that helps remind me that after the larynx, then we have this split. If we follow the trachea, that's when we're getting more into the lower respiratory tract. So anatomically, that's how we break this up. When we think about it physiologically, there's this difference between what we call the conducting zone, which is basically just air transport, and the respiratory zone, which is where actual gas exchange occurs. The conducting zone is just simply air that's going from the atmosphere traveling into our respiratory system. And so we see that in the nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, and in some of the bronchioles. Starting with the bronchioles, then we start to have this shift. Once we get to, I believe it's the terminal bronchioles are what ends the conducting zone. Then we get into the respiratory bronchioles. And at that point, respiratory bronchioles down to the alveoli, that's where gas exchange is going to occur, this exchange between oxygen and carbon dioxide. So that's kind of how physiology and like certain functions are related, or certain characteristics match certain structures within the respiratory system. So let's see. So that's an intro to the respiratory system. So the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system are connected. And so here's a picture from the textbook that explains kind of what's going on between systemic veins, systemic arteries, pulmonary veins, pulmonary arteries, and how we have this transition between deoxygenated and oxygenated blood. And we see in the capillaries here where this gas exchange is occurring. And so remember that gas exchanges are from an area of high pressure to low pressure. So where there's an abundance of something versus a lack, we're going to kind of, swap. So in this example, when we're going from deoxygenated blood, right? The carbon dioxide is going to go into the lungs, but the oxygen, because it's highly concentrated in the alveoli, it's going to go into the blood. Fast forward to when we're, delivering this newly oxygenated blood to the body cells in this example, we have a ton of oxygen in the blood. So now we get to give it to the tissues, and then the tissues give us carbon dioxide. So high pressure to low pressure. You can also think about like where it's abundant versus where it's lacking. And so I want you guys to tell me, whenever we mention the term gas exchange, when we talk about blood, we talk about respiratory system, which two specific gases are we talking about? Which two gases are we talking about when we talk about gas exchange? Which two gases are being exchanged? Yeah, we have oxygen and carbon dioxide. Perfect. Good work on that. All right. So as we've been talking about, air travels from a region of high pressure to a region of low pressure. And so we're going to compare the levels of pressure between the atmosphere and the lungs, and it's going to help us identify the physiological action or response that's going to occur. So, for example, if the pressure in the atmosphere is higher than the pressure in the alveoli or the pressure in the lungs, if that's the case, inspiration is going to occur. And basically that means we're going to inhale. So if the pressure outside and the pressure in the atmosphere is greater than the pressure in the lungs, in the alveoli, we're going to inhale. If the pressure in the lungs, if the pressure in the alveoli is greater than the pressure outside or the pressure in the atmosphere, expiration is going to occur, or we're going to exhale. So that is your key. So when we think about inspiration, right? Inspiration occurs when the atmospheric pressure is above the alveolar pressure. But what is going on when that happens? So when we inhale, tell me, and this is a select all that apply question, what happens when we inhale? What happens to our lung volume and what happens to our diaphragm specifically? So I see lung volume increases, yes, and the diaphragm contracts. So as we breathe in, the diaphragm is going to get lower, and that's contraction of the diaphragm. As that diaphragm gets lower, it allows our lungs, or our lungs are filling up with air, so our lung volume increases. So what would happen during expiration? What would happen to lung volume, and what's occurring in the diaphragm as expiration's occurring? Yeah, so as we're expiring, right, the diaphragm is going to go back up into its relaxed state, and the air is going to leave the lung, so our lung volume is going to decrease. Cool. All right, so that's what we have for respiratory system. So our last chapter is the renal system. Oh, good, we're good on time too. Any questions on the respiratory system before we talk about the renal system? No questions? Okay. Cool. Let's talk about the renal system. So I'm going to try to annotate on here so that we can type the answers. So when we say renal, what do we mean by renal? What is the other name? What does renal mean? Or what organ is it pertaining to? Yeah, the kidney. So the renal system is talking about the kidneys, and it's a system that regulates extracellular fluid. Most people have 2 kidneys, And these two kidneys work to form something out of blood. So blood is going to travel to our kidneys, and our kidneys are going to kind of work with the blood and form something. What is that something that we're forming from the blood? Think about the function of the kidneys. What's its job with the blood? What does it do to the blood? Yeah, we're going to form a filtrate of the blood. Some of this filtrate is going to stay within the body, and then some is going to leave the body. So the way we describe that is some is reabsorbed and some is excreted. So urine that is formed is coming from this filtrate of blood that is destined for excretion. So it's not, so the two kidneys are going to form filtrate of the blood. Some is going to be reabsorbed. About 80% will be reabsorbed. 20% is going to be, form that filtrate. And so whatever filtrate is destined for excretion in the form of urine, it's going to exit the kidney. But which specific part of the kidney is it going to exit? And I'm not talking about the nephron. I'm talking about the actual kidney itself. What is the first structure that's on the outside of the kidney that is going to connect to the rest of the urinary system so that this urine can be excreted? And you can use this picture to help. Yeah, the 20-80 split. So 80% of blood or is going to be reabsorbed back into your cardiovascular system. 20% becomes filtrate. So 20% oftentimes, actually you guys can tell me, is it all of the 20% that's going to be excreted? There's a slide on that on, I forget what number it is, but there's a slide that I think there's like 2 or 3 that give you those numbers specifically. So I would double check those because it has a really good explanation on like what's considered, like which percent is considered filtrate, which percent is reabsorbed. And it's that relationship between 20 and 80. But then there's another slide that talks about like which is actually excreted. So I would double check that one. I can't remember off the top of my head like the specific number. But it's definitely in your lecture slides. So which structure of right outside the kidney that this urine that's destined for excretion is going to enter? So it's exiting the kidney. Okay, I'll help you guys out with this one. So we call this the renal pelvis. We see right here in this green structure, right? So it's not in the kidney, but it's not the ureter. It's this kind of transition between the ureter and the kidney. So it's going to exit the renal pelvis. So we talked a lot about how kidneys are going to filter blood. Some blood's going to be reabsorbed. This filtrate that's formed, it's going to form urine. It's going to be excreted. So how does blood get into the kidney in the first place? Well, blood, systemic blood specifically. So now we're getting into this connection between, when we talk about blood flow through the heart, right? We end with systemic arteries are delivering oxygenated blood to our cells and tissue. Here's an example of how systemic oxygenated blood in systemic arteries delivers blood to our cells and tissues. So here in this example, we're talking about the kidney. So the renal artery, which is a systemic artery, is going to deliver oxygenated blood to the kidney. And then the kidney is going to do all of its functioning, with the filtrate and the reabsorption and excretion and all of that. Forming that filtrate is like the main function of the kidney. So after the kidneys form its filtrate, any blood that's going to be reabsorbed is going to leave the kidney via which vessel? Think about systemic arteries, go to the organs, the organ functions, does all its stuff, and then which systemic vessel is going to deliver the blood back to the heart? What would we call this one? So it is a vein. You're absolutely right. And so because we're talking about the kidney, just to be specific, we call this the renal vein. So you got renal artery and renal vein. You're absolutely right, bringing it back to the heart. So blood enters the kidney via the renal artery, and then blood that's going to be reabsorbed exits the kidney via the renal vein. But now in this last problem, we're not talking about blood. Well, we're starting off talking about blood, saying blood enters the kidney via the renal artery. But now we're talking about the filtrate. Now we're talking about urine. So urine is going to exit the kidney via the renal pelvis. And then after the renal pelvis, it's going to go through these two long tubes, and then it's going to reach the bladder and then the urethra, and then we're going to urinate it out. But what are these two tubes called that connect the kidney, or the renal pelvis specifically, to the bladder? Yeah, the ureters. Cool. So good work answering that. I'll leave it up here for like 10 seconds in case you guys are writing stuff down. Yeah, and again, with this chapter too, because it's so complex, I do recommend looking back on the lecture slides that were provided from lecture, because they have a lot of detail. A lot of these review sessions, I try to do like an overview or like a summary just to give you guys a big picture. And then obviously going over the lecture slides. And if you guys have the textbook and you find that helpful too, has a lot of information on that as well. So good work on answering those. Okay. So now let's see, what time is it? Okay, yeah, we've got time. All right, so let's do some more practice problems. So within the renal system, we talked about the kidneys, but if you were to take a kidney and slice it in half, you would see all of these, this network of vessels and these structures, these small coiled little structures within the kidney. And these structures are called the functional unit of the kidney, because this is where all of that filtration is going to be occurring. Filtration, reabsorption, urine formation, excretion, or delivering it to be excreted. What do we call this functional unit of the kidney? Yeah, the nephron. And so the nephron has two main components. What do we call those two main components of the nephron? Give you guys some time to think about that. The two main components of the nephron. Okay, we talk about the renal corpuscle, which by definition is the glomerulus and its capsule. We see here in this picture the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule, otherwise known as the glomerular capsule. And then we have the tubules, which the tubules we see right here. We got the proximal. I know I accidentally labeled it as distal. I made this a long time ago. Ignore that. Pretend it says proximal. We got the proximal convoluted tubule, got the loop of Henle, and then we've got the distal convoluted tubule. So yes, the the renal corpuscle, and the tubules. So the glomerulus is a network of specific type of vessels, if you will. And these vessels that make up the glomerulus are enclosed within the glomerular capsule, otherwise known as the Bowman's capsule. So which type of vessels do we see within the glomerulus? Or what network do we see in the glomerulus? What do we see? What is the glomerulus made up of? Yeah, so we got capillaries within the glomerulus, and then that's enclosed in the capsule. And so the next question is talking about this blood that is entering the nephron. This is what we were talking about earlier. 20% is going to become filtrate. Oh, where's the percent? 20% becomes filtrate, and 80% is reabsorbed back into the blood vessels. And so when we talk about filtrate, and we talk about filtration, what is filtration? Filtration is the movement of something from the glomerulus to its capsule, then the tubules, right? And we already talked about too when we were describing this. You start off with a proximal convoluted tubule, and then you eventually, after the loop of Henle, reach the distal convoluted. But what are we filtering? Like, what is filtration? What is moving here? Think about what filtration is. It's the movement of something from the glomerulus to the glomerular capsule. What is moving during filtration? Fluid, yeah, could be. Let's think about what else. What are we trying to like filter out? Moving to waste. See where you guys are going with this. There's a specific word. See if there's a good way to explain it. So I see why you put fluid, because like, obviously there's water. But another thing too that we think about is that we think about solutes, right? Solutes, types of salts, stuff like that. So oftentimes it's the movement of solutes. And if you guys are looking at your lecture slides too, if there's like other things that are listed, feel free to put it in the chat too, so that we can add them at the end. but I was specifically looking for solutes. But if there are other, if there's other wording in the lecture slides, I'd love to hear that too. But yeah, solutes, because these solutes are gonna, want to be filtered out, and this is where we kind of get this this end product of 20% becomes filtrate, and then we think about urine formation and excreting waste. So I can see why you guys put waste, but then 80% is just blood that's going to be reabsorbed back. So good job answering these. You guys did a good job. So go ahead and clear these, and then we'll go to our last slide, and then we'll have time for questions at the end, so we can talk about that. So this is very similar to the other stuff we've been talking about. We're going to kind of go over pathways and see if we can match. This is a word bank on the right. Again, no order. It's just the words that we're going to use to fill in the blank. So let's start with number 1. So something is going to enter the kidneys through renal arteries. Something enter, yeah, arterial blood. Perfect. So actually what I'll do, since I won't have room to type, this is what we're going to do. We're just going to check this one off that we already used it. Arterial blood enters the kidney through the renal arteries. Awesome. These arteries are going to branch. Now, if we think about, we're getting into the kidney, imagine this blood going into the nephron. These arteries are going to branch to form a certain type of arterial in respect to the glomerulus. Which type of arterial is the first one that we're referring to? Afferent, yeah. And I like to say, I know that you guys learned about like afferent versus efferent with the nervous system, even though that's not what we're talking about here. The concept of the words are the same, in which afferent, I like to say arriving. So, this afferent arterial is letting blood arrive to the glomerulus. Comparing to the efferent arterial, right? I like to say exiting the glomerulus. So same kind of verbiage that you guys could use. So yeah, there's that. And then let's answer. Okay. So after the afferent arterial, blood is going to enter what? Yep, the glomerulus. And then as the glomerulus does its filtration, right, 20% of blood is going to become filtrate, and it's going to exit the glomerulus into what? We actually already talked about this, the efferent arterial, right? So now we've got this filtrate, and it's going to travel through the rest of the neuron, and it's going to travel through the tubules, but there's a specific order. Which is the first tubule that it travels through? Right after the glomerular capsule, right after the efferent arterial. Now it's this filtrate that we want to excrete and turn into urine and make it be excreted. Which tubule is it going to go through first? Yeah, proximal. And then after proximal, we've got the loop of Henle. And then, of course, we've got distal. So we've got proximal convoluted tubule. It's going down. We got this little loop of Henle. Distal convoluted tubule. Then we've got the collecting duct. And then we talked about this earlier, the renal pelvis, which is right outside the kidney, goes down the ureter. Now at this point, where urine is traveling down the ureter. It's stored in the urinary bladder until it is time to be released. And so what is the fancy scientific term for releasing urine, for urination? There's a special word that we use in physiology. Yep, micturition. So urine is stored in the urinary bladder and it's waiting there until micturition is ready to occur. So that's the filtrate, and that's the urine. But what about the 80% of blood that is going to be reabsorbed back in? So blood remaining in the glomerulus, which is about 80%, is going to leave the nephron through the efferent arteriole. So it's going to be exiting. And then, or actually, I think I might have put the wrong thing for one of these. Renal veins. Okay, I'm sorry. Continue. Yes, efferent arterioles. And then it's going to be reabsorbed through a certain type of, oh, I realized what I did. Pause 1 second. So number 5, when I said filtrate travels through the, I did not mean to say efferent arteriole. This is, sorry, not number 5. Sorry, number 4. Number 4 was supposed to be glomerular capsule. I apologize sincerely for that. So number 4, 20% of blood filters out of the glomerulus into the glomerular capsule. So that's glomerular capsule. Number 5, we got right. We talked about the proximal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubule, collecting duct, renal pelvis, ureter, bladder, micturition. So now number 6, blood remaining in the glomerulus, 80% of it is going to leave the nephron. So now we're talking about the efferent arteriole. I apologize. So the efferent arteriole is where, of course, this blood is exiting the nephron, exiting. So efferent exiting, blood is exiting the nephron. It's going to be reabsorbed through specific types of vessels, and then it's going to exit the kidney through another type of vessel. So what are the two vessels? Where is blood after the efferent, or, around the glomerulus too, around the tubules? What do we call these vessels that are going to reabsorb this 80% of blood that is going to remain? So renal veins are going to exit the kidney, because we talked about this earlier, how this blood is going to exit the kidney through the renal veins and go back to the heart. But there's also another type of vessel that works with reabsorption of this 80%, kind of then and there within the nephron, or around the nephron. Yeah. So we have these peritubular capillaries that are around the nephron, and then we have the renal veins that kind of end the job with bringing the blood back to the heart. So good job answering those. And I'll show you the picture of what this looks like. It's colored in orange here. So you see these orange little vessels, these are the peritubular capillaries. So that's what we have. And so that is what I have for you all.